to cover the now-deceased Biden spending bill 3 times over. With that much money, we could build like a Mecha United States that shoots fire, or remake Avatar 30,000 times. There's a lot we could do with that money is my point. And yet a US Treasury report recently found that America currently collects less tax revenue as a percentage of the GDP than almost every other point in recent history. Why is that? Why is the IRS both a nuisance and totally ineffective? How did we get to this point? Also, seriously, why aren't we doing anything about Jared Leto? There's some grim stuff happening with that guy. Anyway, let's start with a bit of history, because it turns out that things that were then affect things that are now. Also, it turns out that the IRS, even in its earliest iterations, has always been a struggle. Our country's first official version of tax collection was founded because of a request by then Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. That's right, a mediocre rapper and terrible singer came up with the first of several attempts to create a tax system in the US. See, I'm not sure if you realize this, but taxes were sort of a sore spot for us early on. Something about a word that rhymes with taxation. It's not important, I'm sure. And even though this first attempt specifically only targeted whiskey producers, as in a tax on whiskey and nothing else, this almost immediately led to an uprising of violence. The Whiskey Rebellion, great band name, consisted of distillers flat out refusing to pay the taxes, which led to a tax on tax collectors, which led to roughly 700 people showing up at a wealthy tax collector's house and waging war, which led to a 7,000 strong march in Pittsburgh that was met by 12,000 militiamen. Which is a long way of saying that shortly after Thomas Jefferson took over the presidency, he immediately abolished the whiskey tax that proved impossible and dangerous to enforce. After that, America kept pretty quiet about taxes, only whipping them out whenever we had a war to fund. The War of 1812, for example, saw taxes briefly return. Then, of course, came the other one, the Civil War. Once again, the U.S. needed money, and so Congress passed the Civil War Revenue Act of 1861. Not only did this create the Office of Commissioner of Internal Revenue, but established the country's first income tax. This income tax specifically targeted citizens with an income of over $600, which for the record is about 15 to 20 grand today. If you made over $10,000, or roughly 250 to 320K, you would be the subject to a 5% tax. Meanwhile, the people in the middle were taxed about 3%. Seems fair. You pay a bigger percent the richer you are. They knew this back in the 1800s. This percentage was increased a few years later following a heated debate in Congress. Steamy. One opposed to the increase, Senator Justin Morrill, claimed that increasing the tax rates would create a risk of class warfare. The horror! Coincidentally, Morrill was so wealthy that he managed to retire before the age of 40, and the taxes would continue to be challenged by politicians who happened to also be very rich. Curious. In the 1865 case of Springer versus the United States, then future House of Representatives member William Springer would challenge the constitutionality of the 1864 Act over taxes for his income of $50,798, which is nearly $1 million today. The government ultimately won that case. Sure, why not? After the war, the income tax was repealed, and we went back to tariffs and duties. But it was during this time that people began to realize that simply taxing products and not taxing wealthy people created a system in which small businesses and people buying goods were most affected. And so in 1894, we saw the creation of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which was the first non-wartime income tax. Portions of this were actually challenged and ruled unconstitutional. However, in 1913, Congress passed the 16th Amendment that gave them the ability to collect income taxes without any strings attached. And as we blasted into several world wars, the decisions made to fund those wars would continue to shape our modern system. In World War I, the US passed the War Revenue Act, which raised income tax rates while lowering exemptions. This led to the US increasing its tax revenue from $809 million in 1917 to $3.6 billion in 1918. After this war, we got the Great Depression as a fun little intermission, during which FDR signed the Social Security Act into law, which at the time simply focused on retired workers in need who were over 65 receiving benefits based on their payroll tax contributions. You could argue this was the first actual instance of our earned tax dollars directly helping people on a federal level. Schools, for example, are funded from property taxes and decided on locally, which of course led to ridiculous differences in quality depending on the area, but that's another video. ago. Anywho, next came World War II. Two World II War, I believe it was called at the time. And so Congress passed a new Revenue Act, which amazingly increased the amount of Americans paying income tax from 5% to 75%. In order to not make everyone go broke, it was here that the government required employers to withhold money from paychecks so people wouldn't be slammed with a large lump of taxes after spending what would have been their tax payment on the 1940s version of a PS5. A Slinky that was sold out for a year and a goddamn half. Anyway, a lot of things would happen after this that would make tax collectors more important and get big snooty heads about it. Prohibition was enforced by IRS agents who, of course, would later take down Al Capone. The modern Internal Revenue Service wouldn't be officially named that until 1952 thanks to Harry Truman, who, and this is important, also fought heavily against Congress as they tried to make budget cuts to the agency, saying at the time, "I am advised by the Secretary of the Treasury and the Commissioner of Internal Revenue that the reduction of $20 million in the appropriation for the Bureau of Internal Revenue will mean a reduction in personnel of 4,000 to 5,000 employees and will result in a direct loss of revenue of not less than $400 million in the fiscal year 1948. There is at the present time, with present personnel, a backlog of 30,000 leads on tax evasions awaiting investigation." In other words, it was clear in the late 40s that reducing funding to the IRS would actually cost the government more money because it would hurt their ability to collect taxes. It would gunk up a system that at the time was already facing a backlog of cases. And this is where we start seeing the problem. Unfortunately, between this time and today, another thing had to happen. A man named Ronald Dildo Reagan would become the president. And RDR was of course known for the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, something for which Republicans would praise him to this day as a move that brought on economic recovery.
Ronald Reagan also signed the largest tax cut in history. He reduced government regulations from Washington.
He did.
And economic growth exploded.
Ah, yes! When Ted Dildo Cruz ran for president, he often talked about wanting to bring us back to Reagan economics. He talked about it all the damn time. But what Mr. Dildo and a lot of the other GOP dildos failed to mention about this point in history is that while yes, in 1981, Reagan passed one of the largest tax cuts in history, this was followed by him raising the taxes 5 times before his presidency ended. Almost once a year, he raised taxes with the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982, Social Security Amendments of 1983, the Deficit Reduction Act of 1984, Tax Reform Act of 1986, and Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1987. And these adjustments, when you do the math, appear to completely reverse the cuts he initially made. Cuts that, at the time he made them, Reagan framed with the quote, "It is our basic belief that only by reducing the growth of government can we increase the growth of the economy, mommy." See, there's a myth that happened during Trump's sad little term that tax cuts pay for themselves. But it should be noted that even when Reagan made this first big cut, his own people predicted that government revenue would fall because of them. That was part of the point. Small government, rich people trickling down, etc. Ronald McDonald was counting on spending cuts to make up for the loss. Cuts that did not happen. And so slowly the taxes went back up. Some studies of the subsequent economic recovery found that while those initial tax cuts could have helped, it wasn't nearly the sole reason we bounced back. For one, interest rates were also cut. And also it was found that greatly investing in our infrastructure would create more jobs, which is exactly what we did at the time. More specifically, Ronald Reagan raised fuel taxes 125% and spent that money on our highways. The woke socialist radical Ronald D. Reagan's Build Back Good plan. And so, as our economy recovered, Reagan was gradually raising taxes every year. This is all to say that the man who really set the standard for the GOP's belief in tax cuts didn't actually cut taxes, and in fact sure appeared to be wrong in his initial belief on how to grow our economy. And this is what set the stage for when America began to fundamentally break the IRS. Taxes at this point were routinely challenged by the mostly wealthy as the country became more and more complex. Between FDR and Reagan, we would see the expansion of Social Security and formation of Medicare. And Rodildo clearly learned that whether or not you like taxes, they are needed if you also want a modern country that functions. But then, thanks to the myth of Reagan's actions, one of our two major parties, I won't say which one, began to fantasize about perpetually cutting the taxes needed for these programs. All the nuance of Reaganomics was lost, and when we hit the 90s, there grew a full-on assault on the service of revenue, internal. And we'll talk about just that after an ad, or heck, maybe 2 ads. There's no